A hush fell over the lavish banquet hall as Owen, the gray-haired handyman, stepped forward from the shadows. The mansion's owner, arrogant millionaire Victor Astor, had been bragging about his perfect new building design, spreading its blueprint across the gleaming marble table for all to admire. But now all eyes turned to the quiet old repairman who dared to clear his throat. Owen's calloused hand trembled slightly as he held a pencil above the immaculate plans. Victor's cronies exchanged amused looks, and a few snickered under their breaths. "Well, go on then," Victor sneered, folding his arms. "Fix it if you can. In fact, if you manage to find a real flaw, I'll hand you the deed to this very mansion." His tone dripped with sarcasm, certain that a mere handyman couldn't possibly find fault in plans drafted by top architects. Owen swallowed, recalling ghosts of calculations past, and gently set the pencil down on the paper. With one swift, firm stroke, he drew a bold line through the center of the blueprint. The room went dead silent. Victor's smug grin faltered as he and the others leaned in to inspect what Owen had done. In that breathless moment, the only sound was the pencil rolling to a stop. One stroke of Owen's pencil had just silenced a room full of laughter and ridicule, leaving everyone staring in shock at the blueprint and at the humble handyman who had dared to correct it. Victor's face flushed red with indignation as he snatched up the marked blueprint. "You have some nerve," he growled at Owen. "Explain this mess now." Around them, wealthy guests and architects shifted uneasily, eager to see the confrontation unfold. Owen stood his ground, surprisingly calm for a man being glared down by a furious billionaire. He pointed to the area he had struck through. "Sir, this section here," Owen said quietly, "it won't support the weight above, not for long." Gasps rippled through the small crowd, but Victor scoffed, unwilling to cede any authority to his handyman. "Do you really expect me to believe that my team missed something so elementary?" Victor snapped, crumpling the blueprint in his fist. "Who do you think you are, old man?" His words stung, but Owen only lowered his eyes. He knew exactly who he was, even if no one else in this room did. In that moment, Owen resolved to prove his point, not out of pride, but out of duty. Lives could depend on it. Clearing his throat, Owen faced Victor with a steadiness that belied the turmoil inside. "Give me until tomorrow," he said softly, "and I will show you the correction, properly." There was quiet confidence in his voice that gave everyone pause. Victor's lip curled in a half sneer, but he hesitated. A part of him, however small, felt a prick of doubt. The silence was broken by the estate's chief engineer, who ventured, "It can't hurt to double-check, sir. If he's wrong, we'll all see it. If he's right..." The implication hung in the air. Owen might be preventing a disaster. Victor exhaled through his nose and slapped the blueprint back onto the table. "Fine," he spat. "Tomorrow morning. But if you waste our time, you're finished here." He shot Owen a withering glare. As the guests dispersed in hushed whispers, Owen carefully rolled up the blueprint, his mind already churning with calculations he hadn't touched in years. That night, Owen sat alone in his modest cottage on the edge of the estate, the blueprint spread across his kitchen table. The only sounds were the crickets outside and the steady tick of an old clock on the wall. Under the glow of a single lamp, Owen's weary eyes pored over every line of Victor's grand design. It was an impressive 60-story tower, Astor Tower, meant to crown the city skyline. But Owen saw what no one else had, a fatal weakness buried in those lines. As he traced a finger over the print, his hand shook not from fear, but from the weight of memory. 2 decades ago, Owen had poured his heart into a similar blueprint, one of his own design. Back then, he wasn't a humble handyman. He was a celebrated architect known for bold, innovative structures. He remembered the pride of cutting the ribbon on his masterpiece, and the horror when part of that very building collapsed in a windstorm months later. 4 people were killed in the tragedy. An investigation revealed that a contractor's cost-cutting caused the failure, but Owen took the blame to heart. Racked with guilt, he walked away from his career and never looked back. In the years that followed, he drifted in search of peace, taking on unassuming jobs far from the spotlight. That path eventually led here, to Victor Astor's estate, where he kept his head down and his past to himself. To the world, he was just Owen, the handyman, reliable, quiet, ordinary. Yet here and now, faced with a blueprint flaw hauntingly similar to the one that had ruined lives, Owen knew he could not remain ordinary. Taking a deep breath, he unearthed a dust-covered tube from his closet containing the tools of his old trade, relics of another life. He unsealed it with trembling fingers, heart pounding with resolve. Spreading fresh paper over Victor's blueprint, Owen pinpointed the structural failure waiting to happen, a key support beam designed too thin to bear the load. In a major storm or under heavy occupancy, that beam would buckle and bring the tower down. Not again. I won't let it happen again. Pencil in hand, he began redrawing critical sections, sketching additional columns and thicker beams, with calculations scrawled in the margins. Equations and angles flowed back into his mind as midnight passed and the early hours crept in. The ghost of his former genius guided each stroke of his pencil. By the time pale dawn light filtered through the window, Owen's cramped kitchen was littered with coffee cups and crumpled paper, but before him lay a corrected blueprint. Exhausted, he rubbed his eyes and allowed a faint, proud smile. He had done it. The design was now safe. Rolling up the revised plans, Owen felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't merely fixing a drawing, he was redeeming himself. In a few hours, he would step back into Victor's world not as a meek handyman, but as the architect he was always meant to be. Sunlight streamed through tall windows as Victor, Owen, and a handful of engineers gathered the next morning in the mansion's stately library. The atmosphere was thick with skepticism. Victor sat at the head of a long, polished table, fingers drumming impatiently. Beside him stood Mr. Langley, the lead architect of Astor Tower, his jaw set in annoyance. Owen entered quietly, carrying under his arm the tube containing his revised plans and something wrapped in cloth. He felt dozens of eyes on him, heavy with doubt. Victor raised an eyebrow as Owen unrolled the corrected blueprint onto the table. "All right, let's get this over with," Victor said coldly. "Show us what you've got, Owen." The use of his first name, usually spoken with casual disregard, now came laced with challenge. Owen nodded respectfully and stepped forward. With a steady hand, he spread out the blueprint he'd worked on all night, laying it beside the original for comparison. A few of the assembled engineers leaned in, curious to spite themselves. Owen cleared his throat and began. "The issue lies here," he said, pointing to a cluster of red marks and notes he had added on the 20th floor plan. The support structure in the center of the tower was designed too thin. Under normal conditions it's fine, but under certain stresses it would fail. Mr. Langley rolled his eyes. "Our design passed every standard check. What certain stresses are you imagining exactly?" he interrupted. There was a bite of sarcasm in his voice. "Earthquakes? Hurricanes? A stampede of elephants?" A few people snickered, but Owen didn't flinch. He picked up a page of handwritten calculations from his folder. "A hurricane, actually," Owen replied calmly. He looked directly at Langley's scowling face. "Your plans account for wind from the north, south, east, and west, the usual scenarios, but they overlooked wind hitting the building at a diagonal." He drew an X in the air with his finger. A strong quartering wind could increase strain on that thin support by nearly 50%. In a storm, those beams would buckle. A silence fell. One of the junior architects furrowed his brow, quickly doing mental math. He leaned toward a colleague and, his numbers, they actually make sense. The chief engineer exchanged a concerned glance with Victor. Mr. Langley, however, was not convinced. "Highly unlikely," Langley scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "We haven't had a storm like that in a century, and our building has a safety margin." His tone was defensive, but a bead of sweat had formed on his temple. Owen took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment he had dreaded and prepared for. "I used to think that way too," he said softly, "until I learned the hard way that unlikely doesn't mean impossible." His voice carried a weight that made Victor and the others glance up in curiosity. There was something in Owen's eyes, experience, pain, that gave them pause. Setting his notes aside, Owen carefully lifted the cloth-wrapped bundle he'd brought. Unveiling it, he revealed a small wooden model depicting the skyscraper's core structure, about a meter high, meticulously crafted to mirror the design's critical section. Gasps of surprise rippled around the room. Throughout his long night, Owen had taken time to build this visual aid. "This is a scale model of the tower's central support frame," Owen explained. He pointed to a thin wooden rod in the model's middle, corresponding to the under-designed beam. "I built it to demonstrate what my calculations already show." He lifted a brick-sized metal weight and held it above the model. Every eye followed, wide and unblinking. "This weight will simulate the additional stress of, say, a severe diagonal wind or an emergency full occupancy." Langley opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to warn that the model wasn't an official test, but no words came. The room was too transfixed. Owen's hand hovered for a moment. He felt his heart pounding. Then he gently placed the weight onto a platform atop the model. For a second, nothing happened. The model's spindly wooden frame held the added weight, until it didn't. With a sharp crack, the thin central rod snapped. The entire model groaned and collapsed inward, wooden pieces clattering onto the table. A collective gasp erupted. One engineer reflexively stepped back as if the real tower were coming down. Victor bolted upright from his chair. Mr. Langley's face went pale as the elegant representation of his design lay in ruins. Owen's stomach clenched at the sight, a grim confirmation of what could have been. He looked up to meet Victor's eyes. "That," Owen said, voice grave, "is what would happen to Astor Tower in a worst-case scenario." He scanned the faces around him. Only it wouldn't be a model breaking, it would be the real building, with real people inside. The library was dead silent, except for a single piece of wood from the model still teetering, then falling to the table with a faint clink. Victor's hands trembled slightly, realizing the catastrophe narrowly avoided. "If we'd built this skyscraper as originally planned," Owen continued, "it could have collapsed. Hundreds of lives would have been at risk." His words hung in the air like a dark cloud, intense and undeniable. Victor sank back down into his chair, his face drained of color. He stared at the broken model, then at the red marks on Owen's blueprint that highlighted the corrected supports and reinforcements. The tycoon, usually so quick with a smug remark, was at a loss for words. When he finally spoke, his voice was hushed and unsteady. "Good God," he muttered. You're right." Around the table, the others began exchanging looks of respect and astonishment. The chief engineer gently picked up Owen's sheet of calculations, his eyes widening as he reviewed them. "These calculations are spot on," he announced, almost in disbelief. "His analysis is correct." Mr. Langley opened and closed his mouth, searching for an argument that never came. In the face of the evidence, pride had to yield to reality. The great blueprint he had once defended now unmistakably bore a fatal flaw, one that only Owen had seen. Owen let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief, triumph, and vindication all warred within him. After so long keeping his head down, he had stepped up and proven himself in the most dramatic way imaginable. He allowed himself a small, humble smile. Victor Astor slowly stood up. He straightened his suit jacket with a shaky hand and cleared his throat, trying to regain a fragment of his composure. His eyes met Owen's, and in them was a mixture of gratitude and lingering shock. "It appears," Victor said quietly, "that I owe you an apology and a debt." A few hours later, the mansion's library had emptied of everyone except Victor and Owen. The grand room was quiet now, sunbeams slanting in to bathe the mahogany shelves in a warm glow. Victor stood by the window, looking out at the estate grounds, lost in thought. In his hand, he held a folded document, the property deed to the Astor mansion. Owen remained by the table, feeling oddly out of place in the silence after the morning's drama. Victor finally turned to face Owen, his expression a mixture of chagrin and genuine respect. "I was wrong about you, Owen," he admitted, breaking the silence. "About a lot of things. You not only saved my project, you may have saved lives, and you saved me from making a terrible mistake." Owen shook his head modestly. "I'm just glad I could help, sir. I never wanted to embarrass anyone." Victor gave a soft, rueful laugh. "Embarrass me? Perhaps I needed a bit of that," he said. "I was so blinded by pride that I refused to even consider something could be wrong. You taught me otherwise." The millionaire stepped forward, gaze earnest. "I owe you an apology for the way I treated you." Owen met Victor's eyes and saw sincerity there. "Apology accepted," he replied kindly. "And for what it's worth, your team is talented. They just missed what I caught." He shrugged, and for the first time Victor saw not just a handyman, but a man with profound experience. Victor hesitated, then asked quietly, "How did you know all that? Those calculations, the model. You spoke like someone who's been building all his life." Owen gave a faint smile. "After Eastbridge, I tried to stay hidden. Being a handyman felt safer than designing again. But when I spotted that flaw, I had to speak up. I couldn't let history repeat itself." Victor nodded solemnly. "And thank God you did." He unfolded the deed in his hands and cleared his throat. "You know, when I challenged you yesterday, I was so sure of myself that I wagered my home." A wry smile crossed his face. "I'm a man of my word. You did exactly what I asked. You fixed the blueprint. By my promise, this mansion is now yours." He extended the deed and a heavy ring of ornate keys toward Owen. Sunlight caught in Victor's eyes, which now shone with a softer warmth than Owen had ever seen. "Take it," Victor said warmly. "You've earned it." Owen stared at the keys in astonishment. He gingerly accepted the deed and keys, the reality sinking in. This magnificent estate where he had quietly labored was being handed over to him. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Owen murmured. "This is too generous. I never wanted your house." Victor chuckled, the sound gentle. "Call it fate or poetic justice. Besides," he added with a grin, "I have other houses. But there's only one Owen." He rested a hand on Owen's shoulder. "If you'll allow it, I'd like you to stay on as a lead consultant for Astor Developments. I could use someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong." Owen let out an incredulous laugh as the tension of the past days finally released. I think I'd like that," he replied, feeling the passion for architecture rekindle fully. "I won't waste the second chance I've been given." In the aftermath, Owen's corrections were officially adopted into the tower's blueprints. Mr. Langley, swallowing his pride, revised the design under Owen's guidance to ensure Astor Tower would be safe and strong. True to his word, Victor kept Owen on as a trusted advisor in his company. Word of the handyman who saved the skyscraper spread quietly, and Victor himself became a changed man. No longer did he dismiss those of humble status. He had learned that wisdom can come from the most unassuming places. His pride had been humbled, and he was grateful for it. One warm summer evening, Owen stood on the mansion's grand balcony, his balcony now, watching the sun set over the gardens. The weight of guilt he'd carried for so long was finally gone, replaced by peace and quiet pride. He held the old mechanical pencil from his pocket, the very one that had drawn that fateful line. That single stroke had prevented catastrophe and rewritten both his life and Victor's. In the end, a pompous millionaire wagered his mansion on a dare, and a quiet handyman's hidden brilliance won the bet. But more importantly, humility and respect replaced arrogance, and a long-lost architect reclaimed his legacy. It was a redemption neither of them will ever forget.